Welcome back to Side Quest, episode 002 with Mr. Wesley Shantz and me, Mr. Alexander Schmid, or just Alex Schmid, or Alex, or whatever. Last time we got to talking about Spirited Away, and we realized that we had way too much to say about Spirited Away, and so we went back and made that part one, and now this is part two, and well, we'll see how far we can get into this. And so I thought I would also say something about what Side Quest is about. So Wes and I both have our own projects, and on our projects we talk about great books, and Wes also talks about a specific video game which links to the great book. But well, part of what we're trying to do in lecturing about great books is get at the essence of all stories, you might say. And so what we're really attempting to do in Side Quest is to talk about some more popular stories. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, right now Hayao Miyazaki, films, stories, video games that seem to have captured the imagination of everybody, of our culture. And just so the basic idea is that we're going to go into major works from our culture, and we're going to see if we can find the same themes inside of those that we have found in the great books, and thus see if we can establish what is in scholarly circles been called the Homeric chain, or the great chain of being. And well, it's nice to have you back, Wes. Another Sunday and another good day with you.
Yeah, glad to be back, and I like the project here for Side Quest. I just would add in that the name comes from something that is from video games. So as great books are, it seems like there's an extra layer that gets added in there with the game. So
yeah, and so well, the reason that we're talking about Spirited Away again today is that you were saying, Wes, that you really wanted there are a few major topics that we didn't get to. Particularly, I think you wanted to talk about something about the use of water in Spirited Away. I mean, obviously,
yeah.
It's a bathhouse, and so water is used to cleanse and to pamper the spirits. But what was it? What were some of the thoughts that you had there, or the questions you had that you wanted to pose?
Yeah. So there's kind of two sides to that. Yeah, I agree that the spirits coming in and being cleansed is interesting, and particularly the stink spirit, right? What they think is a powerful kind of pollution, but it turns out to be this river god once they run the powerful water and herbal remedies over him, and he flies out cackling. But then there's also the big flood that happens after that, and I was really interested in how the flood changes the whole landscape, and sort of makes what was already a pretty magical world even more surreal somehow, and particularly with the connection between those two things being this kind of magic, this magic artifact from the dragon. It's never really clear what it is. It's like some kind of cake or biscuit or something that he gives Chihiro, and so that comes up a few different times throughout the story. But so there's this, yeah. So we talked a little bit about the eating thing last time, and this time I want to talk about water, which has to do with refreshment and with drinking, of course, and sort of life in that sense. It's a source. It's a reflective thing, and it's something which floods, right? It flows over the world. So what are your thoughts about that? Just kind of throwing all that out there.
Well, interesting, just to add into that, there is also the initial flooding of the river that was dried up that the parents and Chihiro had first crossed. And so because of that flood, she was both trapped in this new world as well as she that was the river across which the spirits which were coming to the bathhouse were crossing. And so the river trapped her in while also enabling them to bridge the gap between where they were coming from and where they were going. And so it defines the space. It creates a new space. So water, it's interesting. Peterson talks about Tiamat representing the primordial chaos, and thus the water from which we all came, both metaphorically and literally, given the primordial soup. But water, in the more Poseidon sense, the more Olympian sense, can also limit. It can serve to limit the borders of your nation. For an example, if, say, you're like a modern American, or you happen to be an ancient Greek at that time. And even to this day, I'm told that naval power is akin to power over the world. And so water defines and can also be undefined in this case. But something interesting when you were describing the river spirit, and he's described as a very powerful spirit who is at first misconstrued as a stink spirit because he doesn't even flow. He's become so gross that he's now sort of a slug-like mud entity with proboscis coming to proboscis or proboscises or something coming out of him. Probosci, I suppose. I'll have to look it up later. And so he's disgusting. He's nothing like a river. He looks like a stink spirit. He's completely misidentified until the effort is taken by Chihiro, a heroic effort to cleanse him. And it almost makes me wonder whether it would be acceptable to propose a metaphorical understanding of him as sort of somebody who's either ideologically possessed or simply possessed of poor, unrooted opinions rather than the pure springs of thought. As if one's head were filled with nonsense and garbage and trash rather than any pure springs of thinking. And the language of pure springs of thinking goes at least back to Dante, and long before that in terms of like the river Lethe. And I was just reading Dante in The Sphere of the Fixed Stars, and he brings that up multiple times in his conversation with Peter in Canto, moving into Canto 24. That's where he has the conversation with Peter. But I'm wondering if it's something like Chihiro puts in the work of doing actual thinking rather than simply thinking up nonsense opinions, and that helps to start getting rid of the polluted nature of her thought. It replenishes her being through replenishing her thought. Almost as if one's falsely rooted opinions or unconsidered opinions could lead to corrupting one's being through improperly informing one's behavior and one's actions in the world.
Yeah. The interesting thing about that seems like the spirit is the source, right? Is the spring, and yet it's been polluted. And so it's like, what do you do when the spring has been polluted? Because that's where cleansing is supposed to come from.
That's perfect. Great question. So what does she do? She notices. She uses awareness, alertness to see a handlebar sticking out from this mud creature that's not truly a mud creature. So two things. She, emphasizing sort of the spirit of the Odyssey, sees that there's something that's unseen here. There's a known unknown. There's something she's missing there. The appearance is not reality. And so she's aware, she's alert to what could this be exactly. And so what does she do? She investigates. She gets close to what's disgusting. It's sort of the alchemical sticking your hand into the feces in order to get the gold from it. And well, what does she see there? She sees just a handle out of place sticking there. And well, what does she do? It's almost trauma inducing, right? It's like it's just a little handlebar, and then she, along with a community, which you might imagine is bouncing your ideas off those in a community, pull this piece of trash out, which is linked to tons of other trash that all comes flowing out from it. It's almost as if one bad thought is never just one bad thought, but is part of a network of inferior and possibly envenoming or poisoning thoughts, and poisoning in that they keep you from the well springs of being, of seeing truth, of basing your behavior, your observation of the world on something which is actually invigoratingly true.
Well, so then it seems like all of those things by themselves would be useful, right? The bicycle and the I think the last thing that pops out is like a fishing line.
Yes.
And then
there's a drain thing pulled out.
Yeah.
A drain stopper. Excuse me, drain thing.
Yeah. But so each of those things in itself is useful and good, but when they aren't taken care of, when they're chucked aside and they kind of pile up, right, carelessly, then it takes this huge effort, right? Like I think that process you're describing seems like a good scheme to work with, right? You have the individual who gives it some attention, who probes it, and then gets a community to rally, and make it right. And then, but this something else interesting about the dragon then is that he doesn't seem to speak, right? He sort of cackles, and he like has this great exhalation. He's like, ah. But then he flies off super fast,
And he says, well done, like a god would, right?
oh yeah.
Well done. He accepts the sacrifice, like of Abel's sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that I would say is, and this is a slight dovetail from your point, but, well, it's not a dovetail, it's just a slightly different direction, which I guess could be a dovetail in a different way. I'm not disagreeing. What he does is he accepts the sacrifice of Chihiro. He said what she needed to do to clean him out and possibly clean her thinking out is she had to sacrifice. She had to work. She had to put some effort into it. And how much effort does it take to come up with an opinion? None. And like you said about the useful objects within him that would be useful if appropriately implemented, well, that's the problem with not properly organizing your thinking and therefore your behaviors in life. When you just lump everything together, it loses its value. You have to use tools at the appropriate moment with the appropriate amount of force and skill. And so he lacked appropriate hierarchy within himself, or her thinking lacked appropriate hierarchy within itself, which is interesting because what does he come in as? A giant ball of essentially mud that's all glommed together. It's like an image of stuffing everything together, and therefore it loses its unity or distinctness. Everything, it's like a pile of trash becomes like an ignoble or disgusting unity at the expense of the unity of each useful thing that makes it. It's sort of the opposite of what a democracy is supposed to be, right? You're supposed to retain your individuality while also becoming part of a larger unity, whereas here you lose your individuality in order to become part of a larger unity, which you might say is sort of like what happened in, say, the Soviet system, for example. But what's interesting about that, what I just wanted to connect with, was that, well, the bathhouse itself is a majorly hierarchical system. There are overseers, there are people at the bottom like Chihiro. There's, of course, the sort of queen mother at the top, the Yubaba. But this guy comes here, it seems, to organize his thinking. That's what he can get from a place like this, to straighten him out.
Yeah. It's
I know that
funny
was a lot.
because, like, I was just sort of thinking about how the great rivers of antiquity where civilization develops, right? They're all along rivers, and the river seems to sort of bring it flows with the fertility that sort of washes down. But then if it gets too choked up, well, then your civilization's not going to be in good shape. I think it's largely also a commentary on pollution, like just literally pollution.
Sure, of course.
I mean, that's something that you see in all the great video games and animes and stuff. That's a big concern, environmental pollution and just human kind of negligence.
But I would wonder to what extent that environmental pollution, literal thinking, comes from mythological thinking that is supported by the idea that, I wonder if it's a projection onto the world of the polluted nature of our thought. That we've thrown all thinking together, and therefore all thoughts are egalitarian, regardless of whether you're a good thinker or not, and whether you're rational or not. You're, of course, equally entitled to your opinion, which somebody else is equally entitled to. But that doesn't mean that you're equally competent in terms of thinking. And so I wonder to what extent even the desire to observe pollution and environmental issues in the world is a projection of our need to clean up our own thinking and our own beings in the first place. And I would suggest that one perhaps only even pollutes within the world because one feels himself polluted, and thus the world as an extension of himself is worthy of pollution as well.
Yeah, clean up your room sort of thing.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But
Sorry,
broken
not to
the
be.
broken windows social theory, which suggests that if there are broken windows in a neighborhood, it is more likely that more windows are going to be broken because that's perceived as the norm. I would say plays equally in nice neighborhoods, right? It's feedback loops. And a place that looks well kept together with no pollution around it, if you are to throw a piece of litter on the ground, that will be the first piece of litter, and therefore you will be doing something anomalous, and that would be something you're less likely to do, therefore, because it will draw negative attention to you. Whereas if you're in a place with a bunch of broken windows and trash everywhere, just throwing another piece of trash on the ground, well, what's the big deal? That seems to be de rigueur in that place, normal. And so why not? And so what I think is heroic about what Chihiro does here is she doesn't just assume he's another stink spirit. She doesn't just go through the motions. She gives it her all. She's like an individual, a hero here. And in so doing, she cleans up the spirit not only of herself but of her people, of the bathhouse's ethos as itself. It's I'd say sort of a retelling of how the individual with the awareness of Horus restores the old wise king who's blind. And who's the wise king? That would be the dragon here, because it's an old wise man. It's a positive figure of the old wise man, right? It's the second positive old wise man we've seen. We've seen Kamaji, who's sort of an underworld king down in the basement, and like a heart figure shooting magical fluids that restore people through circulatory style veins to the bathhouse and keeping its heat going. He's sort of like a male version of Hestia from the Greek tradition. But also, this old wise man, well, in being purified, well, so something interesting I wanted to say about him is that, so a couple things. You mentioned that he sighs at first, and then his head appears. She's in this sort of liminal space Chihiro is with him, and this mask, this broken face, this wooden looking face appears and says, "Well done." And then this little round piece of food that's very helpful but bitter appears in her hand. And it's almost as if saying that cleansing your spirit gives you the ability to dole out and deal with bitter truths that can cleanse the spirits of others. And that would make sense, right? Because eventually later Haku, she gives a dose of truth too, and that helps clean up his act, right? He spits out the worm that Yubaba was controlling him with, which she could only control him with because of his ill intention and purpose towards her, his evil intentions, his malicious intentions, as Dante would say. And well, who else does she give a piece of that to? Well, No Face. And what has he been doing? He's been engorging himself on sort of people who are made out of sin or greed or lies. And so he's been feeding, like we were talking about last time, on insubstantial food that has nothing has made him full, everything has made him fat. And so the dose of truth he gets, well, he shoots out all the, you might say, all the bullshit, right? All the BS, all the nonsense, and then follows sin, right? And so it's almost as if hard work or sacrifice leads to a correction of one's thinking that leads to one clearing out one's poor thoughts or unhelpful thoughts, which then leads to a cleaning up of one's act or one's being through replacing one's sort of superficial and foolishly informed behaviors with behaviors informed by bitterly learned or difficultly wrought truths. And that gives one not only the power to cleanse one's own being, but actually the beings of those around one, because truth seems to affect us all equally. So it doesn't exactly matter where it comes from.
Right. The other thing, I think if I'm remembering right, as the water goes down, isn't there little bits of gold everywhere, and everyone's
Yes.
Yeah. So it's like it's the dragon and the gold thing, but it's an interesting take on it. And you've also got this kind of elixir, which is in solid form, like you're describing this bitter truth. So it's got a lot of
So she
interesting.
enriches everybody by discovering
Yeah,
this truth, right? With the gold.
yeah.
That seems to be what that means, right? And gold is a symbol of divinity and codified divinity. And so they sort of get the material reflections of the truth that she gets, which can actually transform, right? They are unredeemed by the gold, though enriched by it.
But so the interesting thing is that this is not where the story ends, like not in any way. So it's like there's something else going on, especially for Shihiro, right? She tries eating the fruit. It's got a really complex and apparently not that comfortable taste. But she's eating it while she looks out. She gazes out over this flood.
Yes.
Changed the whole environment. It's like I think that there's something interesting there because I agree that there's something about boundaries, but it's also this surreal. Like my favorite music in the movie is probably when they're on the train, and it's this theme which is really simple, and it starts really low in the piano and it goes all the way up through the scales, and just kind of repeats real gently as they're riding the train, and they go by all these little places, right? So they've skimmed along the surface of this thing which was a boundary, and it's taken them to all these. It's like there's all these other stories which are going on, which we just sort of see little shadows of and pass them by, and then we come to the swamp, and it's kind of this alter ego of Yubaba who's out there. So there, yeah, some kind of transformation has taken place, but she's not quite done yet, right? And there's definitely more to the story.
Right. And so at one point, we see Haku come back, and he's being chased down by paper bird figures that are actually little like human figures with pointed wings, and they're looks like tens of thousands of them chasing him down and cutting him up. And he actually goes into the water right while he's trying to chase them away, but they follow him there, and then he shoots up into the air and they continue to follow him, and then shoots back into the bathhouse and they continue to follow him there. And well, he's deeply injured, and Chihiro has to do some serious work in order to keep him okay. But that's where we meet Zeniba for the first time and find out that if we want to heal Haku, which Chihiro does want to do because she now sort of loves him, and there seems to be an unspoken connection between them, which we later find out is the fact that she fell into him. He was a river that she fell into, and the current caught her, and that was him, and he saved her when she was young. And so he's sort of like a Jesus figure in that way, and that the Spirit baptized her and then saved her, and she was reborn afterwards. And that fits well with the fact that he's something of a young woman's animus figure, and that he is the figure of male perfection that leads her into society, that gives her he's sort of the prince at the ball that the lady is working towards impressing and therefore marrying in a traditional sense. At least as the folk tales and the vast majority of stories from the history of the world until the last 40 years or so would have put them forward. So that's interesting. So Kamaji, again, this underworld sort of positive old man, this positive patriarchal figure, the positive king rather than the negative king. He gives a ticket for the train on which Chihiro then goes, which is a train that Lynn, the sort of positive female who had been slightly older than her, who had been helping her out, says that she'll someday get on. So Chihiro has already achieved more than her, possibly because she's actually willing to sacrifice. In fact, that's something that's directly said by Kamaji to Lynn, right? That, what is she doing? Oh, something you would know nothing about. Kamaji says to her, this is true love. And so what does love do? It gives you motivation. And so you move, you get out of situations. You get the ticket to a unique situation where no one else is invited. And so, like you said, Chihiro then is on the train, and the train is on a track, which is, the track is just slightly submerged in water, right? It's just a couple inches below, but it's still going along the edge. So it's very much as if the train is skirting along the water. And so it is sort of the bounded, so in Dante's Canto 24, it says of Peter that he walked across the water like Jesus did, but because of faith. And so it's almost as if we can put faith in Chihiro getting the job done now because she has proved her capacity to sacrifice for another for no personal gain. And so now when she's given the job to go face Zeniba, who is, as far as she knows, an evil and powerful witch who can kill and eat her, she's willing to do it, even though all she's doing is saving somebody that she loves.
I like that. It's really interesting. Yeah, then the image of
the love leads you into the unknown, the waters of the unknown, or the chaos of the unknown. It's like, why would you confront the unknown that is so terrifying for something less than love? But sorry, go on. I'm just thinking it through.
Yeah, I think the connection between the story of Jesus and the baptism in the water, but also the walking on water, that seems relevant. But it's also Chihiro who's saving him. So it's sort of, after he saved her, but that's only revealed at the end of the movie. That's probably the part where I was least able to follow the movie the first time I watched it. It's like, okay, there's some weird stuff happening, but this is where I really got lost. Like, how is she in the water right now? And it's only after watching it a few times that I think I make the connection between Haku and the dragon and the river. And then it's sort of, there's this kind of realization. And I think that seems to be the thing that's missing, right, is Haku's name. And she gives that back to him, right? She tells him who he is, and tells him his true name. And
the
so
Kohaku River, right?
Yeah.
And so his name was actually very similar to what his name is, Haku, and he's the Kohaku River. And well, so that does seem to be what happens, because I think if you notice closely, even though I don't know Japanese, at the beginning of the movie, or at the beginning of Chihiro's term of service as now Sin, because she gives up her name to Yubaba only takes parts of the character, parts of the kanji up. So Sin is probably a part of her name, or a part of the kanji being left there. And so it's like Yubaba restrains you or confines you to her service by taking a part of you away. And what would that part be? It's probably your ability to reflect and therefore exert your own force of will. You have to follow her choices and therefore her willpower and her considerations. So you lose a part of yourself, and perhaps the most important part of yourself, that which is most unique to you. And your name represents therefore your intellect and your will's ability to choose that which your intellect thinks or reflects. Something interesting too that you mentioned about, so after Chihiro is picked up again by Kohaku, and Kohaku is now in dragon form, and he's presented himself as a very mighty dragon to her finally, and shown himself for what he is. He's this dragon. And what is this dragon? Well, it's this thing full of new information. It's this new part of Chihiro's life, right? The fact is she's coming of age, and this is a story of coming of age. And so what is the dragon, and why is it also a young, handsome man? Well, because in this next stage of her life, she's going to be expected to court and eventually become, say, a girlfriend and a wife and a mother. And so a young man is a dragon for her as a symbol of the unknown from which the treasure comes, because, well, this is the next major task she is going to have to face, understanding the masculine. And in fact, so she begins doing that very quickly. She's riding on him, interestingly enough. He's a dragon. And she tells him, in interacting with him and seeing him in his putatively true form, that now she remembers his name, that through interacting with him, she has come to understand him in some way. And she whispers his name to him, and he is in some way free, delimited from the service that he had. It's as if, it's actually very much like the Adam and Eve story, right? She has already eaten this bitter pill of truth, and she's given it to him, and she's already realized, interesting. At this point, it's unclear to me whether she still knows her name or not, but the fact of the matter is she helps him to become more conscious in the way that Eve enabled Adam to become more conscious after she ate of the fruit. So she tells to him what his name is, which helps him to assume his individuality again, which gives him back his human form. And what's the difference between a human and a dragon form? Well, it's better defined in that human is where place of free choice can occur, rather than simply force of, even a dragon could be a force of will for, say, Yubaba, could be a servant to her. And in fact, that's why he's a good servant, because of his high level of competency and skill as a henchman, though not thinking necessarily for himself, though he does disobey her pretty heavily. So he clearly does do that.
Yeah, so the thing that seems to, I think, maybe to just like connect this with the rest of, well, a dominant image in most of these films is the flight, right? Somewhere in them there's going to be a flight sequence, and it's really interesting that the way that it works, like you're describing, it starts out with him in a dragon form, the dragon scales fly off, and then he's left in a human form, but they're still flying hand in hand. And so it's like there's a release, right, from the bondage that they've both been in at that point. Right, and so
there's a greater unity now. In fact, when they land in front of Yubaba, they will be united at a bridge together, holding hands.
Yeah, and then, well, so but then the movie ends, and it's again throwing in a pretty clear biblical reference where he says you can't look back, but that's in the Greek stories too, right? You can't look back.
Eurydice, yeah. So it's in all of those stories, and therefore a universal motif, at least from those middle places in the earth.
Oh, sorry. Just to bring this back to the old man dragon from where we started, it strikes me that Chihiro is maybe one of the bravest things she does in the movie is to not look back, right? She succeeds where all those mythological figures seem to fail. And she is, well, but she seems to be on a really good path, like you're describing, to go into the next stage of her life. And, this is where the story ends. Like, we don't see that stage. But I guess I wonder about, what's up for Haku next? Is he going to end up like the dragon? Is it a kind of cyclical story for him, whereas for her it's a linear story?
Well, what's interesting about him is that his tragedy at first is that the river that he's the spirit of disappears, and so we think, well, how can you continue to exist? But the fact of the matter is, he does continue to exist. And so, how does a spirit that's lost its material root continue to exist? Well, it has to become a more abstract spirit. It has to represent something more abstract. So rather than simply the flowing of a river, perhaps he could represent all rivers, or the flowing of all rivers, or the truth, the more abstract aspects of a river. So one thing he actually says is that he's going to do is now that he no longer has a slug inside of him controlling him from Yubaba, that what he is going to do is go talk to her immediately after Chihiro passes her final test. And so, well, that's something I wanted to mention too. He says that he's going to be freed now from Yubaba, which means that his initial loss of his river led to him restraining himself in a lesser way, sort of like to an ideology, to Yubaba, because he lost his original truth, his Edenic truth. But now it's going to enable him to find a higher freedom, a freedom in which he can choose his place in the world, it seems, and how he's going to interact with it. And now it seems that he's going to desire to be a force for good because he's been saved by a human. And so perhaps he'll be a helpful spirit to humans because there's some reciprocity between them. And that's something I really love about this story, that there's reciprocity between how the humans treat the spirits and how the spirits treat the humans, suggesting that, sort of like the Greek gods and the Greeks in the Iliad, that they're one and the same. And, well, something I did want to mention is that Chihiro still does have to finish a final test on a bridge where she has to identify her parents with those pigs. And none of the pigs happen to be her parents. And I think that's interesting because the test is sort of when she comes back into the cave, the Platonic cave, can she see the truth? Or will she be deceived by the lies, the superficial rather than the substantial? Because if she can still be deceived, she is not yet at that next stage of life. She is she is still requiring a guide that is outside herself. She still requires a Virgil to her Dante. But no, she succeeds in this test. She recognizes that none of these pigs are actually her father and her mother. And I would suggest that that also means that in her moving into this next stage of her adolescence, that she's realizing that her parents are no longer simply her father and her mother, but society and nature are the archetypal parents that are going to require of her that she, say, socialize well enough to get, say, like a job and help out in her society. She's going to have to follow certain norms and rules in order to be successful, as well as on a natural way. Well, she's going to have to encounter the realities of being a young lady and dealing with young men and the eventual, courting relationship, marriage, and family that will result from that. And it's looking like what this test is seeking is to see whether she'll be ready to deal with that or not. And if she is, she can be sent back into the world where she'll then be successful. Which actually, that's one of the last lines in the movie, right? Her mom says, all right, do you think you can handle it? Or says, is this scary for you starting a new page? And she says, I think I can handle it. And well, yeah, I'm sure she can after riding on dragons and fighting stink spirits and going across the waters and learning how to sacrifice and love. Yeah, she may be able to deal with high school. We'll see.
The movie opens with her crushing the flowers that she got from her friend. Yeah, and then clinging to her mom's arm as they go through the tunnel. She still clings to her mom on the way back through the tunnel.
Yeah, I noticed that. And I thought that what that represented was her possibility of regressing. And that's why also she wasn't to look backwards, because it's right after you've transformed, I suppose, right after you have gotten to the next stage that you are most in danger of turning back and losing all your progress. And so it is unclear whether she has changed at all until she comes out at the other end and sees, poof, here's an effect of everything that's happened. There's dust on the car, and the parents, they have no clue what's happened because they were out of the game for so long. But you were there, you understood that something happened, and so you know that your transformation is real, and so you can't look back. There's no reason to look back. You have to look forward because now you know that you can operate within the world.
Yeah. I took her clinging the second time to be, different, because she's just missed her parents, and now they're back, and she's very much attached to them still. That it's in a different respect from when she was afraid, right, going into the tunnel.
I'll have to look at it again, but her mom, yeah, that is a kind-hearted way of looking at it. But for some reason, I'll have to look at this specific scene. But there was something about how the scene looked that reminded me exactly of the first time, and there was just an uncertainty about what had happened. The scene struck me as more uncertain than lovingly affectionate, but I could be wrong. I'll have to go back, and once I see it again, then I'll know. All right. Yeah. So have we missed anything on the water?
No, I think that about wraps it up as far as my questions on that. I remember thinking about the connection between the flow of the water and time a little bit, like you're describing, that's sort of the evidence that something actually has happened. That, along with her new hair tie that she's gotten, is sort of like a physical, objective testimony that this thing was real, right? It wasn't just made up. So I found that kind of interesting as well, that something as intangible as time could be evidence for something as radical, substantial as this adventure.
Well, right. And time with the flow of water, obviously very much tied together. I mean, just the very notion of the fact of the tides and how important observing the tide coming in and coming out is to, say, a shipfaring culture, and the relationship to the moon and the pattern of the day and the night. And so nature and time, as Aristotle would say, seem to be very much connected together, and also connecting the notion of thought with time. Thought, of course, exists within time, even though when you're having, say, a great conversation, like whenever I get to speak with you, Wes, it's like time falls away, because perhaps you're using it so appropriately that it is unnecessary for you to take account of it as a factor. And so I see appropriate use of time and appropriate thinking and being as very much like a holy trinity interwoven together in a sort of unitary fashion. Because when one's thinking is clearly reflecting one's being, one is appropriately using one's time by acting within the world in the most strategically efficient and value-based or goal-oriented way. Especially if one's goal, say, is to implement one's values in the world, or to bring about good things in the world, or the highest good in the world, especially if one's aim is simply something like the highest good with one's actions. But something about time is that this is sort of a liminal space, right? Sometimes in mythology or in video games or in folk stories, one goes to a place outside of time in order to achieve something in a sort of montage style format that one could not achieve within time in order to meet the current obstacles. Dragon Ball Z and sort of their time chamber occurs to me there immediately. Thinking about sort of 80s montages also strikes me there. But this is interesting because though it exists outside of normal reality, it doesn't exist outside of normal time. And I'm thinking of a movie. I can't recall whether it's The Matrix or not, but there does seem to be a movie too where one can enter sort of a dream space. Oh, I'm thinking of Inception, of course. So in Inception, recall that one can enter a dream, and in the dream, time works differently, but simply in different dimensions. The amount of time outside of the dream is much less than the time that's spent inside the dream, and that's even expanded out depending on how deep one goes into the dreams. And so the perception of time and what manner of reality one is in seems to be an interesting question. How fast does time pass in these liminal realities? Does time pass, and what does that mean? Time does seem to pass here. It's not outside of reality in terms of time at all, because that's the indication we get at the end, and that's the proof that something has actually occurred.
I think it's traditional in a lot of stories of visiting a kind of fairyland, that when you come back, time has changed, but not exactly how it felt to you. And I think it's true of dreams and things too. And it's, I guess, the idea of an eternal place, like as in a place outside of time, that seems to be hinted at, right? That some of these spirits are gods, right? But they all sort of are manifested in time. And that's toned down quite a bit, right? The movie in English is called Spirited Away, and they're always referred to as spirits. But I think if the subtitles, at least when you turn them on, if they sometimes will translate that same word as God. And so it's a little bit of a I guess a question, just sort of like, what is the relationship between time and eternity? How do different cultures and different stories represent that? It's interesting too, because as someone watching the movie, you've invested this couple of hours or whatever it is, and then it's like a dream, right? It passes, and then you're back out of it again. You sort of like are let back into the world, and presumably changed for the better, if there's kind of a moral content to what you've been spending your time on.
Yeah, it's interesting because the general format, and you could take the Iliad or the Divine Comedy as this, seems to be something like this, or also Milton's Paradise Lost. There's a war in heaven, then there's a war on earth. Perhaps they reflect each other. The war on heaven seems to be, and this would be represented as the bathhouse, where you go to clean out your mind, where you go to have the battle of good versus evil. And good is generally represented by that which is true, which is often beautiful as well. What is it? The Bella, let's see, Veritas, and let's see, I know the adverbs, verum, bonum, and
Fulcrum.
Pulchrum. Yeah, I know. I was like, Bella. I was like, I don't want to say bellum and say war.
That's war.
Yeah,
we were
I know,
talking about one of
I
the,
know. My
yeah.
students are always like, Bella, beauty, and Bella, more. And I say, well, some say that's a false friendship. And, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But there seems to be a war or a drama in heaven, which is played out in the Iliad on Olympus, just like there's a war being played out between the Trojans and the Achaeans. Here in the bathhouse, there's a war in heaven, and we get the stink spirit, and we get this also no face going out there. And, well, the same person or the same attribute which solves the war in heaven is the one that solves the war on earth, indicating that there is a unity or an equal sign or parity between what happens in heaven and what happens in the world. And why is that? Well, it's because when you clean out your thoughts, your behaviors are based on your thoughts. And so when you realize the etiology of that which you do, or the causes of, when you realize the root thoughts lying behind the behaviors you have, then you are capable of cleaning out your behaviors by first altering the thoughts underlying them. And when you can clean out those thoughts, then you can produce a new personality within the world through manifesting new behaviors with differing reasons behind them. It's almost as if you're a new person. And so it's like you've actually cleaned out your mind, and therefore your life. And so I think that's actually what Peterson means when he says, like, clean your room. And so your room is your mind. It's your personality. And so the bathhouse is Chihiro's personality. And so once she cleans that out and gets it appropriately organized based on the right values of not simply just gold or just eating as much food as possible, but of truth and that which actually cleanses and purifies, well, then she can return to the world and actually conduct the appropriate battle of adapting to a new situation, which is going to be high school, which was symbolically played out as sort of an imaginative entryway into this new hierarchy, and then learning how to adapt and succeed and rise in it, which she effectively did. And if she can do it there, well, then she can do it anywhere. If you can properly order your being, then you can properly deal with any circumstance outside of you as well as you possibly could, regardless of what the success is going to be. Because, what is it, the saying of the Jesus? You can't turn one thing either white or black, but you can have the appropriate intention behind it. Sorry, that's a bad reference. I'll get it later. Basically, it said that you can control your intention, but not your output, not your effect.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's the effect. So in a way, right? Like, for me, at least, watching these movies, thinking about them, or replaying the games, listening to the music from this stuff, like, it has that effect of kind of putting you back in connection with a kind of source, and helping to cleanse stuff that's gotten piled up and neglected, and reordering and all that.
And you mentioned earlier that you seem to be describing a feeling something like nostalgia, and we both know that comes from nostos and algae, which means like wound of the home or something like that, or just nostos alone is a homecoming. And so nostalgia is like feeling a wound for a home that no longer exists or something like that. But I understand nostalgia now, at least in this context, as a calling back to a situation in which you left a part of your being, a part of your thinking. So in seeing, say, Spirited Away when I was a 15-year-old, it had an effect on me in some way, but I couldn't understand what the effect was, though it left a seed within me, you might say. It affected my imagination in such a way, it captured or captivated me in such a way that I had to return to it several times over my life in order to understand exactly what that effect was. And in particular, this time, now articulating its effect, I'm coming to realize what the drama exactly is. Sorry, I lost my train of thought while I was saying that.
No, it seems like that seems to be the cure, as you say, right? Great stories seem to be the thing that holds the proper place, which other people or ourselves can get caught up in ideologies instead.
Right. I think the nostalgia is, any great work of art or literature becomes sort of like a Voldemortian Horcrux for a piece of your soul. It affects you in a way so that when you think of it, you think fondly of it because you recall a time of sort of blissful ignorance when you were watching it where you didn't understand things. But the feeling of nostalgia for that time past, I think, is also related to the work of art or the movie that you once saw or the video game, indicating that there's still information in that work of art that you have not yet processed. It's sort of like a traumatic moment, but a beautiful traumatic moment rather than a painful one. It's like that it affected your being so deeply that it left a scar or a mark or a pattern that you have only understood unconsciously and been captivated by. And so you feel this nostalgia because it's supposed to draw you back to the work of art so that you can understand what its effect was on you. And perhaps in so doing that, you can integrate more parts of your personality back into you. And rather than wish to be a child again in some Edenic bliss, you can understand that the point of many of these Disney stories, as well as Hayao Miyazaki ones, are to accept the mantlehood of adulthood and to work and sacrifice for the highest possible values. And well, if you understand that that's the point of the best children's stories that you watched and read, then what way forward is there in life but to accept one's own responsibility and to sacrifice for the highest possible ideals? So instead of having to live in the past, simply feeling nostalgia seems to be a feeling that instigates growth if you embrace it and then integrate into yourself what the story meant in the first place, that enables you to move forward in a charismatic and courageous way in the world, like Chihiro. It's like, you don't want to be like Chihiro as a kid and be like, enjoying movies is good. You want to be like Chihiro as now an adult, accepting responsibility, because, well, if you're listening to this, that's probably what you are.
Yeah, I like the image of the scar. I think that's one we've got to come back to at some point, right? Odysseus' scar and
yes.
the bathing image, and it's that's some food for thought. So
yeah, he leaves a scar on the world that's perceived by Dante in Canto 26 of the Paradiso, which is also the same canto in which he actually sort of interacts with Ulysses in the Inferno. And so things that leave scars on you. And Dumbledore in the very first book of Harry Potter says that scars can be useful things. Harry Potter, of course, has a scar from where he is marked by evil. And Dumbledore says that he has an entire map of London on his knee. And so there right there is our clue to what a scar actually is, or to what nostalgia actually is. When something sticks in your mind or leaves its mark on your body or on your being in any sort of way, then it has untapped information which you need to access. And so can be a great gift to you, though first acquired likely with great pain. And well, perhaps that can give anybody who hears it courage, because everybody's going to go through pain, and everybody certainly has. And so perhaps your scars will teach you things that make you ultimately unique. And what better thing? I mean, they are exactly physical metaphors of that, right? We all essentially look the same with our ears and our nose and our mouth, but your scars are unique to you.
I think that's probably a good place to stop on this. I think that brings our Spirited Away discussion to close. Do you want to go on with Hayao Miyazaki or move on to a different topic?
Yeah, I would love to stay with Hayao Miyazaki for a little while if you'd be interested. I think that we'll have more power as voices if we can stick to bigger themes for longer. If we can offer sort of, because just think of how advanced our analyses will become once we've, like, say, watched 5 or 6. I think he has 6 total movies. If we've watched them all together, the sort of themes we'll be able to interweave. And then if we say watch Disney movies or modern movies like Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings, we can just make it a continuous conversation. That said, I am open to diverting at times as well. But would you be interested in doing Kiki's for our next conversation, or watching Kiki's and then discussing it and interweaving some of the themes?
Yes. I think Kiki's Delivery Service would be a great one to do next. I hope that people watching will send in suggestions and ideas and stuff too, and we'll try to get them involved in the conversation. But yeah, looking forward to that. Sounds good. Yeah,
I can't wait. Thank you very much, Wes, for being on here. And this has been SideQuest 002, Spirited Away Part 2. We talked about time. We talked about flow. We talked about rivers. We talked about truth. We talked about battles in worlds of the spirit and heaven, as well as battles on earth and how there's a unity between them. And if you can clear up your thinking, you can clear up your being, and well, maybe you can deal with the world and take some responsibility. And well, maybe that's a good thing. Until next time.